Today I'm going to be talking about Spark, kind of continuing on from the last talk here. I'm going to be talking about some work that we at CRAY have done in collaboration with UC Berkeley, with the RISE lab, which is the successor here to the AMP lab where Spark was originally developed. We started a collaboration with them a few years ago, did a lot of sort of performance profiling and benchmarking of Spark and Spark on CRAY systems. And it's evolved since then to this new project called Alchemist, where we are looking at ways that we can accelerate some of the aspects of Spark for certain workloads. So first, as an HPC center, you might wonder, well, why don't we just use MPI for everything? And one way to look at this, I just did a simple Google Trends graph here, looking at this is obviously a very coarse metric here, but it just gives you an idea. Looking at the popularity of MPI, or at least Google searches for it, which is how everybody codes these days. Search for things on Google. Look at Hadoop, look at Spark, and we see a definite trend here, an upward trend of Spark. It's becoming one of the more dominant frameworks out there for doing scalable data analysis workloads. And where Spark particularly excels is with embarrassingly parallel workloads with large amounts of data. But some of the use cases that we're starting to see, maybe they're a bit more sophisticated. Some of the machine learning workloads in particular, and we wanted to do a study of that. So this was kind of the start of our collaboration. We were looking at doing linear algebra, matrix factorizations, things like that within Spark to see if Spark was a suitable platform for that. So, what are the pros and cons of using Spark versus MPI for linear algebra type workloads? Well, as we've seen, and really what's really justified some of the popularity of Spark, there's a big ecosystem around it. It has a lot of fault tolerance, makes it very easy to write new applications, prototype, experiment with applications. It has a sort of unified, single, abstract interface, this RDD, which was later evolved into what are known as data frames, but they're based on the whole RDD concept. And Spark does have the ability to take advantage of local libraries. You can link Spark against the Intel MKL, for example. And it gives you automatic fault tolerance, and it gives you automatic built-in support for out-of-core computing. However, we were pretty sure that the highly tuned MPI-based linear algebra implementations would be faster and more efficient. So we wanted to understand, just how much so, how much better MPI is than Spark to know if this is an issue that we need to address or not. So that was the motivation for the initial part of our collaboration. So NERSC as well was involved in this collaboration. They're interested in Spark for data-centric and scientific analysis workloads. The RISE lab, which, as I mentioned, is a successor to the AMP lab, they're interested in characterizing the performance of Spark. Spark is one of their big research projects there, continues to be to this day. And at CRAY, our interest, we have users that are asking for Spark, and they want to understand how Spark is going to perform on their machines. So we did a case study. It was published a couple of years ago at the Big Data Conference in Washington, D.C. And we did the computations and all the experiments on the NERSC CRAY system, since they were involved in this collaboration. And what we did was we looked at 3 real-world use cases for scientific data analysis with linear algebra. We did some CX, principal component analysis using SVD, and non-negative matrix factorization applied to climate science and oceanography and a couple other use cases that are escaping my mind at the moment. That's right, ocean. We had ocean temperature data and atmospheric data were the 2 data sets we used. So this is an example of some of the results that we saw. So you'll look here. You'll notice we have here for each of these workloads here, 100, 300, 500 is indicating the number of nodes we allocated to the job. for each of those three sets there, we have a single bar for MPI, we have 2 bars for Spark. And what that represents, this bar here on the left with the sort of the purple, yellow, and orange, those are the overheads that were introduced by Spark. So the blue and green, that represents the actual compute time. And so we see here, MPI is somewhat better than Spark as far as actual compute time for these algorithms. But if you add in those extra bars there, and notice how those overheads are increasing as we scale up, MPI really starts to dominate. So we wanted to look in a little bit more depth at what some of those overheads were. So we worked with some of the folks at the RISE lab, in particular Shivram, very helpful. He's now at University of Wisconsin, great guy. Helped us to sort of characterize what some of these overheads were. And it really comes down to some of the key things are Spark's scheduling process. They have a single serial scheduler that is not very well tuned for these sort of iterative type of workloads. They also, there's some delays related to task startup and waiting at synchronization points. It's very much based on a bulk synchronous parallel model. So all of those add up to these large overheads that really get in the way, especially in these sort of highly parallel iterative matrix factorization style of algorithms. So sort of our key takeaways here, we saw that depending on the application, data size, what kind of scale you're looking at, your Spark workloads were anywhere from 2 to 26 times slower than MPI when I/O is included. Without I/O, it was actually even a larger gap there. And so, these gaps in performance suggested to us was that it might make sense to interface our MPI-based codes or interface Spark with MPI for some of these types of workloads. So you can still take advantage then of the broader ecosystem around Spark. You can do a lot of your data collection, data preparation in Spark. You can do post-analysis in Spark. But then you can accelerate some of these intense, computationally intensive matrix factorization type kernels by calling directly into MPI. So that was the idea and motivation behind the Alchemist work. So what Alchemist essentially does is it acts as an interface layer that allows you to make calls from your Spark program into existing or custom-built MPI-based libraries by simply writing a small sort of wrapper for the library routines. And as part of the Alchemist package, we actually include some wrappers for a linear algebra library called Elemental. So this allows you to combine the high productivity workloads from Spark with the high performance implementations of some of these linear algebra routines in MPI. Target users for this include, of course, the scientific community that wants to use Spark for analysis of large scientific data sets, and also machine learning practitioners, data analysts who want to run some of these computationally intensive ML and data analysis algorithms that use complex linear algebra underneath. For example, SVD for principal component analysis. So basic schematic here of how Alchemist works. We have our Spark application links in this Alchemist client interface, and through that it can talk to the Alchemist driver there, which talks to MPI processes that have this Alchemist library interface wrapped around it, allowing you to make calls into the MPI library. The basic workflow is your Spark application will send your distributed RDD to Alchemist. Alchemist will then distribute it out to the MPI processes, run the library routine that you called, and then convert the results back into an RDD, which it sends back to Spark. Alchemist can also load data directly from a file the file system. And here's another sort of broader schematic here showing we have the Spark driver, the Alchemist driver communicating. The Spark workers to the Alchemist client interface can talk to the Alchemist, the MPI the MPI ranks running in Alchemist, which all have dynamically linked in the appropriate MPI-based library that you're calling your routines from. You can potentially have multiple Spark applications interfacing with the Alchemist processes as well. Just a simple example of the code here that you might write in Spark, importing the Alchemist functionality. Let's see, registering your libraries here, calling an MPI routine, and here you have the data returned back from your Alchemist call. Looking here at an example, let's see, is this the one I was going to show? Yes, okay, here's an example, matrix. Actually, no, that was not the one. I was going to skip on to the next one. Sorry, I was updating these this morning. I don't have the follow-on slide to that one. So here's an example that I think is actually more compelling than the matrix multiplication example, because this one is looking at a real application here, using Alchemist for a truncated SVD computation. So here we have this setup. Our experimental setup is we've got Spark running on 22 nodes, Alchemist MPI running on 8 nodes, and we're comparing here the performance of Spark plus Alchemist versus Spark. And actually for the orange bars here, we did run Spark on all 30 nodes. This 22 and 8 split is for the blue bars there, the Alchemist bars. So we see here significant wins in performance. And if we look there, one of the questions I often get when we're talking about Alchemist is, well, you're doing this extra communication here by sending the data from Spark to Alchemist, sending it back. How much does that contribute to your running time? And it depends, of course, in large part on what how much computation you're sending off to MPI, how well you can amortize that. But for this example here, we see it's actually a fairly small amount. Let's see, the orange bars there at the top are the Alchemist to Spark send time. The blue bars at the bottom are so the blue bars are sending the data to Alchemist. The orange bars are returning the data back from Alchemist to Spark. So we see that they add just a small factor there, small percentage really, to our total time, and we see huge gains there in performance. Here's another example here on looking at some larger data sets, and here we are looking at, let's see, overall time here, load time. So this is the I/O time here for these different data sets from HDF5, our time for our computation in MPI, and then there in the green, that's the time, the communication time going back and forth from Alchemist to Spark. So we are continuing to extend the Alchemist code. One of the things we're doing, of course, is trying to turn this from research code that was developed at Berkeley. We're trying to integrate it into CRAY's Eureka products, so hardening the code, doing some more testing, adding some stability to it. But we're also adding some new features here. So working on adding support for PySpark and SparkR, in addition to Java and Scala-based Spark applications. We're also starting to talk to the folks at Berkeley about creating a direct Python interface. You could call Spark, for example, directly from, you could call Alchemist directly from your Jupyter Notebook, for instance. Looking also at integration with Dask, which is another sort of Spark-like framework for doing distributed computing within Python. We're adding additional functionality, better support for sparse matrices, and support for built-in integration of additional MPI libraries like ScalaPack. And we're working on enabling Alchemist to run inside of containers using Docker and Kubernetes or things like Shifter and Singularity. There are some current limitations that we're also looking at here as well. So, of course, we have 2 copies of data in memory now. We have the RDD. We also have the copy of the data being used by the MPI ranks. There is a data transfer overhead. We saw that in the graphs earlier between Spark and Alchemist, in particular when we're running on different nodes, which currently, as I mentioned here, the way it's set up, you do need to run the Alchemist and Spark on separate nodes, which increases that data transfer overhead. However, that is one of the things we are starting to look at, if we can address that We're looking at integration of additional MPI libraries as well. And we're also looking at some of the newer fault MPI-based or fault tolerance mechanisms for MPI. So future work here, as I mentioned some of this already, but we want to look at reducing some of these communication costs and seeing if we can actually run some of the Spark and Alchemist workers on the same nodes to reduce some of that overhead there. Looking at additional interfaces between Spark. So right now we just have sort of the Spark to MPI. Like I mentioned, we're looking at adding Python to MPI. We're also looking at doing things like interfacing Spark with the Chapel language as well. And if you want to try this out, it's available, completely open source. It's up on GitHub at this link here, github.com/project-alchemist. Got a couple of papers here. This recently appeared in KDD. Kai Rethage went over there to London and presented the work there. We also had a paper about this at the CRAY user group conference that was selected into the CCPE journal for some of the select papers from there. So you can read more of these sort of implementation details in the journal article here, and more some of the application focused stuff in the KDD paper. So thanks a lot, and happy to answer any questions. So the question was, let me make sure I got it right. The question was, why is Spark more popular? That's a good question. There's been sort of a lot of discussions around that. I think it comes down to the fault tolerance and ease of use are making it sort of a more productive work environment for that's more, I guess, comfortable and familiar for people who are coming out of school today, who are doing most of their their classes in Java and Python. They're more familiar with that environment, so it's easier for them to work in it. And there's also, like I mentioned, the sort of the broad ecosystem of tools that have been built up around Spark because of its popularity. That's a good question. So what would some of the other targets for improving Spark's performance be? We've been focusing mostly on this work to date. There has been some other work around looking at improvements to the Spark scheduler, which is the source of a lot of the overhead. So with Alchemist, we're able to address mostly the if you have some distributed linear algebra kernel you want to run, you can offload that to MPI, but that doesn't directly impact say pure Spark applications. So there's been some work both within Databricks and within the academic community on trying to improve some of those overheads within the Spark scheduler that are, I think, could potentially help some of these issues as well, but more from the pure Spark side. Other questions? Thank you.